This week you will learn about Photoshop's selection tools by following the Chapter 3 lesson, Working with Selections in the Classroom in a Book. You'll be working on this file of these seashells. The name of the file is 03start.psd. Before you get started, I want to give you a little more information about selections and demonstrate some options that aren't covered in the chapter. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to add a new layer to this document. There's two easy ways to add a new layer. First, I can simply click on this page icon here at the bottom of the Layers panel, or I can click in this upper right hand corner where there's a drop down menu, and the very first option at the top is New Layer. If I choose this method, I get the option to give it a name at the same time. I'm just going to say OK. So now I have a new blank layer on top of the shell layer. And again, this is just for demonstration purposes because I want to demonstrate to you, what selections do and why they're so important. So I'm going to paint on this blank layer here with my brush tool. And I get to my brush tool with the B key on my keyboard. So that jumped me to the brush tool. It's going to paint with the color red, so it'll be really easy to see. And I'm just going to draw a nice big X across this document. So you can see that as I paint on this in any way that I want to paint, I can paint any place that I want. Nothing is protected. So let's select all on this layer. And I did a selection here that selected everything on the canvas by doing a Command A or a Control A. And you can see hopefully these kind of dotted lines dancing around the outer edge. And that's a selection. Sometimes we refer to those selections as marching ants. So I've selected the entire document, and the layer 1, the new layer I created, is what's selected. So if I hit my delete key, that's going to clear the contents of that layer. It didn't delete the layer, it cleared the contents of that layer. So now I want to close down the selection or deselect, and I do that with a Command or a Control D. So I'm going to do that, and that deselects, the marching ants go away. And now what I want to demonstrate for you is a smaller selection to show you how it protects the areas outside of it. I'm going to use the simplest selection tool here, which is the marquee, the second tool down. That'll draw out a box or a rectangle. All three of these tools after the Move tool are all selection tools, and you'll be covering that in the chapter. So I'm just going to draw out a box selection. So right here in the center, and I can move this selection around by grabbing in the center of it and dragging it around. As long as I'm on a selection tool and not the Move tool, it will move the selection, not the pixels. So now when I switch to my brush tool with the B, and I draw a big X across the screen, notice that it only paints inside of the selection because everything outside of those marching ants is protected. And that's why these selection tools are so powerful for your editing. So I'm going to, again, deselect my marching ants or my active selection by doing a Command or a Control D for deselect. And again, to clear the contents of these red lines that I drew on this layer, I'm going to do a Command A or a Control A. That selects all of the contents of the document. And then I'm going to hit my delete key, which will clear the contents of the active selected layer. And then Command D will deselect it. Now here's a tip for you. This is going to happen. It happens to me all the time. I see this trip people up all the time. Sometimes you're on a selection tool and you quickly drag and you've actually made a selection. If I zoom in really close, you'll see that I made a selection up here. But sometimes you've done that and you're not aware that you've done it, and you're down here in some part of the image and you're trying to paint on it, or you're trying to create some type of an edit and nothing's working. So I'll go to my brush tool and I'll try and paint and nothing's working, and you think, oh no, the brush tool's broken. What did I do? If you find yourself in this situation, do a Command or Control D, because it's very likely that you have some tiny selections someplace on your document that you didn't see, and that's protecting everything else around it, not allowing you to paint in any of these areas. So if I do a Command D now nothing is protected, and again I have the ability to paint anywhere that I want. I'm going to throw away this layer here now and talk a little bit about the lesson in the chapter. In the lesson, you're going to be cutting out these shells and moving them up into this collage up here. So the first one has you choose the quick select and select this shell, this sand dollar, and then you're going to the move tool and you're going to drag the shell up to the box A where it goes. I'll zoom in on this a little bit so we can see that A better. So I'm going to do this, and I want you to pay attention to what's happening in the layer panel when I do this. So I'm going to click it and I'm going to drag it up, and we see the image moving in the layer panel, but it doesn't create a new layer. So everything's really merged here. And I'm going to let go where it's kind of out of position. Now, as long as the selection is active, I can still move that shell. It's still kind of free floating, even though it's not showing on a layer over here. But as soon as I do, let's just put it down out of place intentionally here. As soon as I do a Command D or a Control D to deselect, it stamps that shell in place on the background. So I can no longer move it. In fact, it's giving me the message that I can't move this because the layer is locked, because this layer is still locked down as a background layer. So when you use the method that they explain in the book, you have to be very careful that you've correctly positioned your object before you deselect it. All right, I'm going to open the history panel here so that I can step this back to where the shell was. I'm going to go all the way back down, back here to the move, back to the quick select. Okay, so now we've stepped back to where the shell was in its original position and it's still selected. And I'll close this up here. Now the next thing I want you to pay attention to is when I click on this shell and start to drag it, the color that's added underneath it is the background color of your color chips here. So let's do a Command Z to move that back. I'm going to switch these colors around by clicking on these arrows here, right in the upper right hand corner of the foreground background color. You can also switch those around with the X key on your keyboard. So now black is the foreground color, red is the background color. Now when I click and drag this shell, notice that the hole underneath the shell is replaced with the background color red. I'm going to go Command Z to put that back. If I release this from being a background layer, right now as a review, background layer is like glued down to the table. So it has no transparency. But if I release this from being a background by clicking on the lock, so now it's a free floating layer. This time, when I click and drag this shell, it leaves a hole. There's actually transparency there. But it's not putting the shell on its own layer at this point. It's still merged into the original layer. And this is exactly how the chapter has you do all of them, where you select and move while it's still merged into the layer. So I'm going to do Command Z again and put that back. There's another method for doing this that I actually prefer better than the book's method, and that is to copy what you've selected and paste it into its own layer. So try this as well when you're working on the chapter assignment. Make your selection and do a Command or Control C, which copies to the clipboard. You can also get to copy by going under Edit, Copy. Let's see, it has my keyboard shortcut here. So go Edit, Copy, and then we're going to paste it, which is a Command or Control V, or Edit, Paste. And notice this created a brand new layer. And that layer has just the shell on it that we copied. If I use my Move tool, I can move this shell up into its position here. And if I deselect it or let go of it, it's still fully editable because it floats on its own layer on top of the original layer. And I still have the original shell down here, which is fine too. So try both of these methods, the one that's in the book, and try the copy and paste method too, so that you get a good understanding of their differences and you can decide for yourself which one you like best.